Would you say that there's any point at which interpreting some event as a miracle might become the best explanation? And if so, what would it take for that to become the more reasonable position rather than, say, holding out for a natural explanation?
That's a good question, actually, is one I did address in the text. Mm-hmm. But let me be clear about my position. I think that there is theoretically places we must grant that, and to do anything else, we're just being dogmatists. Mm-hmm. I don't think any purported miracle to date has even come close to these. I think that we should... So I already talked about what I called the reasonability requirement, that we should posit a natural explanation rather than a supernatural one, if it's commonly experienced reasonable explanation, which means we should, at minimum, only posit a miracle if, in the absence of such explanations, what would that mean? It would seem to require, just think in terms of, if somebody walked in and said they just witnessed a resurrection, what would it take? There would need to be sufficiently skeptical observers, that is, people who are asking the right questions, making sure they're covering all the possibilities, thinking of alternate explanations, etc. And by the way, there's nothing, in the sense of skeptical observer I'm using, there's nothing that says you have to be a skeptic about religions. Catholic Church works pretty hard to debunk miracles, for instance. But just people who would put forth a full and adequate effort to try to uncover a natural explanation. But you would also need, and this is a part that people forget sometimes, they can't just be skeptical, they also have to be qualified. They have to be sufficiently well-versed in whatever the relevant scientific field is to be able to recognize a natural explanation if it were present. So if we're talking about purported resurrections, perhaps a doctor who did an autopsy, who checked for known toxins that put them in a death-like state, etc. Mm-hmm. There's those. We might also add that the miracle should accomplish something, because otherwise it just seems to be weird magic. And then lastly, we'd have to have the chain of testimony that brings the account to us is also very highly credible. First-hand witnesses, extremely trustworthy sources, multiple trustworthy sources, etc. So I think if you had all of those together, there would be some reason to believe a miracle. I should probably add, and it would also have to be something that isn't like at the cutting edge of science.
Sure.
If we don't know whether this certain drug kills you or puts you in a coma, it's pretty silly to say that there was a resurrection. So it has to be things that are generally well known what the natural explanations are.
Yeah.
But I think if you had all of those things, it could theoretically happen. Nothing even mildly close to that is ever happened that I'm aware of.
Right. And kind of going along with that, how would you respond to the charge that atheists simply rule out miracles from the start? That seems to be what a lot of people think.
Well, I just very clearly didn't. But
no, you didn't. But that seems to be what a lot of people think, is that, well, you just don't even allow them to start. So of course you're not going to. They kind of just think we're being stubborn, perhaps, and maybe to an appropriate degree we are. But they mistake that as like, you rule them out from the start.
There's probably two things to be said about that. Mm-hmm. One, I think that has to do with an old stereotype of kind of a caricature of Hume's anti-miracles argument in Part 10 of the Inquiry. Mm-hmm. It was presented as basically question-begging, ruling out the impossibility of miracles, which is, of course, not his argument. But nevertheless, that kind of caricature of arguments against miracles has lived a long, healthy life since then. So that's just kind of a generative where these kind of things come from as a rule, I think.
Yeah.
But I think probably the important second one is also to remember, prior probabilities here. If you don't have independent reasons to think that there is a deity who fiddles with creation once in a while, then you're going to have a spectacularly high level of incredulity. And then maybe it's just apples and oranges. Maybe the reason that they're just not recognizing, or that's really a significant difference, that their account of miracles is going to have a different prior probability simply because they've already helped themselves to a lot of the points of disagreement. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons for the structure of this book. Well, let's look at miracles, assuming these typical justifications for theism don't work, is going to be a very different case than if they do. We have a naturalistic preference in explanation. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to recognize that that's something that theists and atheists and everything in between tend to agree on. That when there's a natural explanation available, we ought to endorse that explanation, unless there's some overriding condition. A simple example I gave is I flip a switch and a light turns on. For any action, we can either explain it naturally or supernaturally, but clearly unless there's overriding conditions, we prefer the naturalistic explanation, and rightly so. And again, that's true for theists and atheists alike. I don't posit a miracle that happened between flipping the light switch and it turning on, at least in the relevant sense of miracle. And so we can and we should have this preference for naturalistic explanation. But as soon as we realize that and combine it with one other thing, there's some really interesting results. So when we combine that with the problem of the many, if I am a Christian, I reject all the miracles of Muhammad. And then you say, okay, but how? Well, I explain them naturally. Maybe Muhammad was delusional in hearing the voice of Gabriel in the cave. But as soon as you say that, given what we already talked about, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and now I've undercut my own. It's a consistent view to say, well, even if I think I witnessed something supernatural, I should have a preference for natural explanations because I've already entered them into my epistemology. We have to grant that seizures can cause hallucinations and various things like that. And so we have these defeaters that seemingly can't be ruled out. And that's going to apply to religious experience. But then we also need to talk about what it would take to actually be convinced that a miracle's supernatural explanation is the correct one. I think there's a lot more detail I could go into those two topics, but I really think it's important to draw out that we're not trying to be a jerk here in denying religious experience and the miraculous. That's just how we are. If somebody walks into the room and tells you, hey, I just saw a corpse get resurrected, there's appropriate incredulity there, especially when we know there have been fake resurrections, and I could very easily imagine how somebody might fake one, et cetera, et cetera. And then adding, but I actually read about it in a book that is full of errors, doesn't actually add anything, it seems to subtract.
Yeah, well, given that you said we naturally sort of prefer natural explanations, even on both sides, nevertheless, I mean, there's no shortage, obviously, of miraculous claims from believers of all kinds of religions. Would you say that the sheer amount of claims adds any weight at all to their veracity? And then piggybacking on that, how might skeptics productively engage people who are just absolutely convinced that they've experienced a miracle?
So there's a couple of things to say about that. I think it's a good question. I think the sheer number actually takes away rather than adds. Okay. For kind of Humean reasons. That means that all of them can't be legitimate. There's contradictory ones, and we don't want all of them to be legitimate. If I may use kind of a graphic example, Albert Fish, has my vote for worst human being of all time. That tells you something. But at certain times when he was eating the bodies of children he had murdered, he thought he was having this close communing experience with Jesus. And if I'm talking to a theist and says, yeah, that probably was, I'm just going to back away slowly. However, hopefully the reasonable theist will say, well, of course. I mean, he had 7 or 8 different documented insanities, and of course that was not veracious. Now we're going to start getting somewhere, but now we have to talk about the list of all the miracles we want to reject. So we want to reject the hucksters, we want to reject the ignorant, we want to reject the crazy, and once you start doing that, you're going to have some real trouble because the level of credulity you use has to be consistent. And if I raise my credulity to reject all the purported miracles of Hare Krishnaism, in a way that I don't raise them for purported Christian miracles, then I'm just inconsistent thinking. But instead, I think that once we set our bar of credulity by rejecting all the ones we want to reject, there's just a very, very short list, if any, left. And then, of course, there's the ones that we seemingly can't have defeaters for, such as singular. I mentioned in the book, there's singular epileptic fits that can cause hallucinations. And maybe somebody has one once in their life, and that's it. Suppose even, I'm not sure how you could eliminate certain causes of hallucination, but assuming you could, and assuming you're a theist talking to an atheist, it's a perfectly reasonable position, and I think it's the position you should take, is to say something like, I know my miracle was genuine, but I have no reason to think it should convince you. Evidence is like that. Evidence is asymmetric. There's, stepping out of the God debates for a minute, there's tons of reasons and situations where I have a good reason to believe something, but due to the personal nature of evidence and history and memory, I can't convince you of it. And so there's nothing wrong with that kind of response, and I think that Hume was right in granting it's at least theoretically possible that there are miracles, but that's consistent with the position that you should never believe testimony that one occurred. It's ultimately the Humean conclusion there, and there seems to be something deeply right about it.
Would you say that the low prior probability of theism gives us additional reasons to doubt miracles occurring?
If we mean by miracle a violation of the laws of nature, that's one thing, whereas if we add that somehow cultivates or supports a specific religion, that might be a different one. So that's going to interpret things a little differently. But if we just kind of stick to the stereotypes of, well, if I don't have reason to think that there's any supernatural being, then yes, that should drastically decrease the likelihood of a miracle as a miracle. That is, as something that is actually a violation of the law of nature rather than something unexplained.